building here back to Zurich. Nice to have you back here, looking forward. For us it's a joy and an honor to be able to benefit from your both knowledge and skills as teachers and spiritual leaders. Dear audience, I'm sure that all of you know the speaker of this evening, Dr. Peyser. Nevertheless, it's a custom to use the person. Dr. Bollag was born and raised in Boston, right? Boston, important city in the world. She studied psychology and Jewish studies in the States, and later moved to Israel. She's married, as we all know, to our friend David Bollag from Basel, not a less important city in the world. Now, I've got a problem. Yaakov gave me 3 minutes to introduce Caroline, but it's a bit difficult for me to do that, as we say, on a regular cut, because Caroline has at least 2 supporting pillars that she stands on. One, she is a clinical psychologist, and as such, director of the Hakshiva Clinic in English. And on the other hand, she also runs her own office as a psychologist. 2, she is a Talmidah Chachama by her own merit, and as such, a dedicated teacher. For example, she used to teach Gemara in Midreshet for about 10 years. Caroline is known, famous for her fire, for her enthusiasm, for her charisma as a lecturer, so we're looking forward to this evening. And last but not least, 3rd pillar, she does have a 200% job by the side as mother and wife, and I admire her, how she achieves what she achieves and how she performs what she performs. Now, Caroline and David officiate as a Rabbanit and Rav of the Zemer Hazayit, nice alliteration, Zemer Hazayit community in Efrat. I tried to understand, to imagine what Zemer Hazayit, the olives chant, could mean. I didn't find out, so maybe, Caroline, you will lose a word about that during your speech. Now, ladies and gentlemen, thanks Google for AMS, maybe. We have some more information nowadays that maybe even our speaker doesn't know about himself. And I found those lines here that the lady wrote, and I want to share it with you. Those lines are written by a certain Mrs. Shira Schreier. Shira Schreier is the wife of Rav Schreier, used to be Ram in Lindenbaum. And Mrs. Schreier writes about her time there, and I quote now, part of the job description of a Ram in Midreshet Lindenbaum is blah 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 blah, as well as joining certain holiday celebrations, such as the Purim Spiel. Brackets, Dr. Caroline Peyser Bollag wrote the best scripts for the staff musicals. Exclamation marks. So it's a pity you don't stay here for Purim with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all an instructive and inspiring shiur. Please come.
Last piece of information was not easy to find. I only recently found it myself last time I Googled myself. Anyway, it's great to be back. And also, one of the nice things is that I would say I know most of the audience already from our different visits here, so that makes it very nice. We've also filled the audience with family to make sure that there's a critical mass. So we appreciate all the families who came. And finally, in terms of Zemer Hazayit, we have a building fund. So I'm sure David at some point will be speaking to all of you about what's unique about Zemer Hazayit, our shul, and about our building ideas. Okay, so tonight the topic is rabbinic attitudes towards suffering. And the reason I chose this topic is that I think that the issue of suffering is one that all of us, everybody, has to deal with in their lives at different points. For some, unfortunately, it's dramatic or traumatic suffering, sudden loss or traumatic illness, some kind of traumatic abuse. But for everyone, there is some degree of suffering in life, whether it's marital discord or problems with children or problems with one's health or one's parents or a job and employment. There's all different ways, large and small, where we experience suffering, and we all have to make sense of it. Obviously, with traumatic suffering, our lives are turned upside down, and it requires a complete reordering of our lives, of how we think about ourselves in the world, about how we feel in terms of our place in the world, safety in the world, as well as our relationship to God, to notions of justice, purpose, and meaning. But even these smaller suffering that we experience on a daily basis or at different points in our lives require us to find meaning and purpose. It challenges us to either find meaning or purpose or to sometimes not know what to do with it. Animals feel pain too, but suffering is unique to human beings because suffering is not just about pain. Suffering is primarily about the psychological experience where we think, why is this happening to us? Why us? What are we supposed to do with it? What is the meaning? What's the purpose? And also, how do we relate to God in terms of what we're experiencing? So I want to look at the first source, which I think is a very powerful one, which I think illustrates this idea very well, that suffering is different than pain. Suffering is a psychological experience of trying to make sense of our pain. So this is a story from the Mechilta, from the Midrash. כשתפסו את רב שמעון בן גמליאל ורבי ישמעאל מעשרת הרוגי מלכות שנהרגו על ידי הרומאים. Welcome, there are sheets right here. Just started so these are two famous rabbis, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Yishmael. They were 10 of the famous rabbis who were killed, Asara Harugei Malchut, killed by the Romans. When they were captured, Haya Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Yoshev b'toheh b'dato. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel was sitting and wondering, questioning, not understanding. Ba'omer, and he'd say, Oy lanu, she'anu neharagim k'mechalelei Shabbatot u'k'ovdei avodah zarah u'k'magalei arayot u'k'shochvei damim. Woe to us that we are being killed now as if we are terrible sinners, Sabbath desecrators, worshiping idols, committing adultery, killers. Look at the kind of death that awaits us. Amar lo Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. So Rabbi Yishmael, who is also going to be put to death, says to him, Ritzoncha shomar lefanecha davar echad. Would you like me to say something to you? Which in and of itself I think is a very key point, which we'll come to later. First he asks, do you want to hear something? So before he tries to comfort him, he first wants to know, are you open to hearing this? Amar lo emor, and he says, yes, speak. Amar lo, shemak shehayita meiseg b'seuda, ba'u anivim v'amdu al pitcha, v'lo hinachtem sheyikansu v'yochlu. So Rabbi Yishmael says to Rabbi Shimon, who was so devastated, maybe one time when you were eating, maybe some poor people came to the door, and you didn't open it for them, you didn't allow them to come in and eat. Amar lo, hashamayim imasiti came. Rabbi Shimon says, God forbid. No, that is certainly not true. Ella, not only that, shomrim hayu li yoshvin al petach. Shayu aniyim bahim hayu machnisim otam etzli, vochlim v'shotim etzli, morachim l'shem shamayim. Not only did I not have poor people wait outside my door, I had guards who looked for poor people while I was eating, to bring them into the house, to give them food, and that they say a bracha. So no, that's not the case. Amarlo, so he continues. Shemak shayit yoshev doresh bahar habayit, little typo. Vayu kol uchlusei Yisrael yoshlim lefanecha zacha datcha alecha. So now Rabbi Yishmael tries something else. He says, maybe one of the times that you were giving shir on Har Habayit, you have this whole huge audience of Am Yisrael. Maybe you got full of yourself. מימיך בא אדם אצלך לדין או לשאלה בעיכבתו, עד שתהא שותה כוסך ונועל סנדלך או עוטה טליתך. So finally Rabbi Shmuel says to him, perhaps, Rabbi Shimon, did it ever happen once in your life that someone came to you for judgment, or they wanted to ask a question in halakha, and you held them up a moment because you wanted to drink a cup of water, or put your shoe on, or put your talit on? Amra Torah im aneh ta'aneh oto. Echad inui merubeh ve'echad inui mu'at. And the Torah says, if you will torture or cause pain to the poor, to the widow, etc., I will pay it back to you. Whether it's a big pain that you cause him or a small pain. So this is Rabbi Shmuel trying to comfort Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And he finally comes up with an example that what person has not perhaps stopped to drink a cup of water before going to answer a question? And look at what Rabbi Shimon says. Amar lo nichamtani Rabbi. He says, you have now comforted me. If you think about it, on one level, it seems almost absurd. Meaning, here he is about to be killed, and his colleague comes to him and tries to find some small thing that maybe you did wrong. He's saying, I'm going to be killed now like the worst sinners. And he comes and he looks and he says, this slight thing. He finally comes with a small thing that maybe you held someone up. And what is Rabbi Shimon's response? Nichamtani. You have found some reason that I can relate to that makes sense for me about why this is happening to me. And this is a comfort. Has anything changed in Rabbi Shimon's life? No, he is still about to be killed in this terrible way. But what has shifted in his experience is his psychological understanding of his state. That now, before, it made no sense to him in terms of his worldview, of his understanding of justice, of his understanding of his place in relationship to God and religion. It made no sense to him. Now, Rabbi Shmuel has come up with a way that he can understand it so that it makes sense to him religiously. It gives it a meaning, and this is a comfort. And what is the comfort? I mean, really, God, checks him on such a level. We'll talk about this as we'll see other sources, but I certainly think that one of the comforts is that now it puts it in relationship to God. This isn't a random act that makes no sense, but rather you have such a close connection to God that he checks. This is not a random act, but this is rather an act of hashgacha. This is God's intervention because there is some small thing that you did. The idea that this is not random, but God's intervention is a comfort. Yeah.
It could be exactly on the other side.
It could.
That he didn't do anything wrong. So you don't have to be afraid at all. And that's the nichud.
It could. But you see that for Rabbi Shimon, that wasn't, this worked for him. But the important thing is, obviously for each person it will be different. But for him, what I want to show is that suffering, so much of the experience of suffering is finding meaning. And when we find meaning or purpose in our suffering, it can transform it. And that's what we're going to look at tonight, is different rabbinic approaches to making sense of human suffering. And we're going to see different approaches. Now again, this might seem like an odd topic for Adar. And it is somewhat an odd topic. But nevertheless, if you think about the story of the Megillah, the story of the Megillah involves a lot of suffering. Right? First of all, on the national level, there was a year between the time that Haman cast his lots until the actual fight. It's true that the decree was reversed a few months later, but they're still waiting in anticipation of what's going to be in this month of Adar. So certainly, once Haman drew the lots until the final war, there was a tremendous amount of unknown, and certainly before the decree was annulled, suffering. And on the more personal level, we have Esther, who, according to the Midrash, was married to Mordechai, who was taken away to live in the house of the king. Now, while every child perhaps fantasizes, with Disney movies about going to be a princess in the castle. This does not seem to be quite the case of living with Ahasuerus. And clearly this must have been something that was very difficult for her. And we get a glimpse as to the difficulty when Mordecai comes to her and says, you need to go before the king. And he says, Umi yodea im la'et kazot higat lamachut. Who knows if perhaps this is the reason why you became queen? The mere statement suggests that this was on both of their minds. Why is it that this happened? Dafka to Esther. Why is it that she was taken away from Mordecai and brought to the house of this relatively cruel king? And what transforms the story for us on the national level is obviously the outcome. That we were saved, and also seeing the divine hand within the story. And what transforms it for Esther on some level is the meaning and purpose that her suffering takes on. When we get to the end of the story, now Esther and all of Am Yisrael knows what was the reason behind her suffering, that she was taken to the king, so that she could end up providing salvation for the Jewish people. So this is something that transforms the suffering into something more meaningful. And perhaps this is commemorated in Tanit Esther. Meaning we have the celebration and Mishenichnas Adar Marbim B'Simcha, but within that we also commemorate this aspect of the suffering in Tanit Esther. So that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. And a lot of what we think about, or I would say also, I think that this is actually somewhat mistaken, is that a lot of times when we think religiously about the meaning of suffering, people go to the notion that if you suffer, it's because you sinned. It's a punishment. Now, not everybody thinks that way, but certainly this is a notion that comes up, and certainly you hear about it in the media in Israel every so often. Somebody will get up and connect. Seemingly to have spoken to the divine, they will connect some tragic event that happened and explain what this is a punishment for. What was the sin that this is a punishment for? Now clearly, you can find within Chazal and within Tanakh notions that suffering can be a consequence of sin. That there's no question about it. And the approaches that we're looking at tonight in Chazal, of course, first and foremost, Chazal relying on biblical sources. So if we look in the Tanakh, we certainly find the notion of suffering connected to sin. Most obviously in the Tochacha, right? There's a whole list that if you don't listen to God, etc., then these terrible calamities will befall you. And if you do listen, then you will receive this reward. We have it also in Kriyat Shema, that we say, Vayayim Shaboa, this is what will happen, and if not, there clearly is a link. The Nevi'im also talk about the link between suffering and sin. Yet, we will see tonight, and also if you just look in the Torah and the Tanakh, you'll see that there are many other approaches and understandings to suffering. For example, if we look at the story of Avot, I don't know how many of us would trade places with them. They did not have simple lives. If you look, Abraham with his 10 nisyonot, having to leave his home, his place, the place he grew up, having to move down to Mitzrayim, having his wife taken, having to sacrifice his son. It was not a simple life. Yitzchak, who experienced being on the altar, and his father nearly slaughtering him. Yaakov himself certainly says about himself that he had a life of suffering, and yet these are figures who clearly had a close relationship to God, and nowhere in the Torah does it suggest that what befell them was due to sin. The only one that maybe we have a hint of midah keneged midah is Yaakov with the brachot. But nowhere is there a statement, and also we see that these are individuals with a close connection to God. So there's one major example where there doesn't seem to be a connection. Another one is the major event that shapes the character of the Jewish people, Shi'abud Mitzrayim. The time that we spent in Mitzrayim as slaves. Already in Sefer Breshit, in Genesis, God tells Abraham, as part of a covenant, as part of a brit, Yadoa Teda ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem va'avadum ve'inu otam. They will be tortured. Is it a punishment for sin? No. There is no sin connected. And yet, there's no question that the experience in Egypt was one of tremendous suffering. We have other examples. Kohelet, who speaks about there being no relationship. You have the person who's a tzaddik and bad things happen, and you have the rasha and good things happen. Kohelet says it perhaps the clearest that sometimes it doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. We have Iyov. That is the clearest statement against this simplistic notion that if someone is suffering, there clearly needs to be a sin. So we're going to see many of these ideas echoed in Chazal and also some other ones. Okay, so take out your source sheet again. And we're going to start with source number 2. So moving from the model of suffering as sin, as a punishment for sin, we're going to see some ideas that look related but are actually quite different. One of the longest discussions of suffering and its meaning in the Bavli, in the Talmud Bavli, is in Masechet Brachot, which you have on your sheet. I actually printed it up in English. That's not all of it, it's just pieces of it. And there's a whole long discussion there about the meaning of suffering. So maybe we'll just read through. We'll read it through, and I'm actually going to read it in Hebrew, and you can follow along in English, and then we'll discuss it. Amar Rava v'yitem Rav Chisda. So Rava said, and some say Rav Chisda, Im ro'eh adam she'yisurim ba'alav yipashpesh b'ma'asav. Shene'emar nachbesad drachenu v'nachkora v'nashuv al Hashem. If somebody sees that suffering comes to him, the first thing that he should do is examine his conduct. Now, when we first look at that statement, it would seem perhaps to suggest that suffering goes together with sin. And that is one way of understanding it. And yet another way is to say that when we suffer, we need to do something with it. And one of the things to do is to examine our lives and our conduct to see what we can do differently. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a sign of sin, the fact that we examine our conduct. But rather that the suffering is meant to do something to shake us up, to challenge us, to force us into growing. Pishpesh v'lo matzah, and here we see very clearly, the Gemara continues, if a person examines his conduct and doesn't find anything wrong. So already built in with this idea that one examines their conduct, there's a possibility that you examine, you say, I'm perfectly okay, I didn't do anything wrong. Then what should you do? Yitleva bitul Torah. Then you should assume the suffering is coming because you are not learning enough Torah. Bitul Torah is something that has no limit. So this is always a good default. That if you can't find something wrong, it's almost like saying, check if you spoke Lashon Hara. Right? Who hasn't done Bitul Torah and who hasn't spoken Lashon Hara? Happy is the person who God causes to suffer, and he will learn from his Torah. We're going to see this pasuk quoted a number of times. But, the Gemara continues, there's a possibility also that you examine yourself and you find also Bitul Torah, I didn't commit. I have made sure to learn enough Torah. So now the Gemara introduces a concept known as Yisurin Shel Ahava. If you find nothing wrong with your conduct, and if there's no Bitul Torah, that means this is a person who's involved in Torah or mitzvot and is suffering. Then what? Then there's a concept called Yisurin Shel Ahava, suffering that is an expression of love. Okay, so that's difficult to understand. But the pasuk brings a pasuk, shenemar ki et asher yehav Hashem yochiach. So one who God loves, he reproves. Meaning, similar to the idea that someone, like a parent and a child. So child, who are to make them grow further. So here we have a radical idea, if you think about it, quite the opposite of a punishment. After you've examined yourself, there's no room for punishment. We have the notion that suffering can actually be a reflection of a close relationship to God. Kind of flipping it on its head. Now I'm going to skip a little bit. Okay, so now on the source page, it's number C. I'm just finding it in here. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Damar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Ne'amar Brit b'melach, v'ne'amar Brit b'yisurim. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish makes a play on the word covenant, Brit. Covenant is a two-sided relationship. Here we're referring to the relationship between God and human beings. And it says in one place the word Brit with regard to salt, and he uses the same word Brit with regard to Yisurim, with regard to suffering. Ne'amar Brit b'melach, where does it say the word covenant with regard to salt? Tichtiv v'lo tashbit melach Brit. Now whenever you bring a sacrifice, you always need to have salt with it. V'ne'amar Brit b'yisurim, and it also says the idea of a covenant around suffering. Tichtiv elu divrei habrit. After the Tochacha, after the part in the Torah that talks about what will happen if you don't keep the covenant, it ends with elu divrei habrit. These are the words of the covenant. Ma brit ha'amur b'melach, melach mematek et habasar, af brit ha'amur b'yisurim, yisurim memakin kol avonotav shel adam. Just as salt affects the meat in a positive way, so too does suffering refine the person. Or here it says, actually here the source is saying Yisurim b'markin kol avonotav, that Yisurim, suffering, removes a person's sins. Now again, that's not the same as saying that suffering comes as a result of sin. It's not saying it's a punishment. Rather, it is saying that when you experience suffering, whatever sins you may have had are cleansed, are removed. So not the same exact thing. But here, by the term Brit, when it's talking about covenant, this goes back to what I said about in the Torah. Here we have the notion that within a covenant with God and within a close relationship, the nature of that close relationship can involve tribulations, trials and tribulations and suffering. And that the best example of that on the national level is the slavery in Egypt. That this was an experience that wasn't a punishment, and yet was meant to transform the Jewish people in many ways, right? It transformed us from a tribe into a people, but also there was an element of transforming us, I would say, on the ethical and empathic level. If you look in the Torah, how many times it says, remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and therefore you know what it's like to be a foreigner, or you know what it's like to suffer, or you know what it's like you have to have compassion for those in society who are marginalized. So there is some effect that this experience is supposed to have in terms of transforming us as a people. And yeah.
So that would mean that suffering is a prerequisite for all mankind to become more empathetic.
That's true. That's true. It wouldn't only be, and I think that it's not unique to, I would say this is an experience, a founding experience for the Jewish people, who are meant as a people to demonstrate that, but I think it's true for all human beings, and I think human beings who undergo suffering many times, that is what transforms them into more empathic, understanding beings.
Or could you?
That's true. That's right. That's right. You can too. That's true also. Okay. So we see here the notion, for a few notions, right? It's not just a few notions. One being that there is a notion of a covenant and of a relationship with God, and that while our first, quite the opposite. These sources are suggesting that a close relationship to God, that in such a relationship there can be suffering that is meant to refine, to challenge, to cause a person to grow. as a reflection of God's involvement in their development and growth. That is certainly present here. Okay, we'll look at the last source, D, which is a continuation here. Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who we're going to talk about on Motzei Shabbat, the experience of him in the cave, but it's interesting to hear what he has to say here in terms of his personality. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai omer, Shalosh matanot tovot natan hakadosh baruch hu Yisrael. There are 3 gifts that God gave Israel. V'kulan lo netanan ela al yidei yisurim. And all of them were given, or they were not given except through suffering. These 3 gifts could not be given except through suffering. Eluhein, Torah, Ve'eretz Yisrael, Va'olam haba. The 3 things that we get only through suffering or through challenge and trial and tribulation are Torah, the land of Israel, and Olam haba. And then it gives you proof texts. We don't need to read through them right now, but in each one showing a pasuk which suggests that Torah goes together with Yisurim, Eretz Yisrael goes together with Yisurim, and Olam haba. So Eretz Yisrael goes together with Yisurim. Those of you who follow the news, those of you who have children living in Israel, we live in Israel, we know exactly what that means. There are many Yisurim that one goes through in order to gain Eretz Yisrael. That's pretty clear. Torah, there's a notion that in order, and this certainly Rav Shimon bar Yochai exemplified in his own life with the 12 years or 13 years in the cave, that Torah is something that one acquires only through suffering, and Olam haba. Well, basically, if you think about it, that's pretty much everything. I mean, if we're talking about Olam haba, and we're talking about Torah, essentially this statement is saying that things that are valuable and worthwhile to acquire are only acquired through trial and tribulation. Right? No pain, no gain. That's an American expression. I'm sure you have an equivalent. But this notion that part and parcel of acquiring something valuable is going to require a certain measure of difficulty, challenge, and suffering. And that is not a sign, not of punishment, not of sin, but rather actually of the value of what it is that you are acquiring. And so that this is part and parcel, essentially, once they put Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Olam haba, of life, that it is going to involve a certain degree of suffering, and it is an expression of God. This too is kind of continuing with the theme that suffering can go together with a close relationship to God. That these 3 things, gifts that God is giving us, come together with challenges. Okay, so this is presenting the notion of suffering being a transformative experience, suffering being a reflection of a close relationship to God, suffering being part and parcel of what we experience in order to achieve worthwhile gifts. Now we're going to take a look, continue on to this next midrash, very interesting. So we're now at source number 3. Amar Rav Yehuda bar Simon, Abraham taba zikna, Amar lefanav Ribon ha'olamim, Adam ובנו נכנסים למקום ואין אדם יודע למי מכבד. מתוך שאתה מעטרו בזקנה, אדם יודע למי מכבד. This is a very interesting midrash, an interesting spin on things that we might not always think are so positive. So first, Rav Yehuda bar Simon says, where do we get the idea of people when they get older, then becoming elderly, not just in terms of age, but also in terms of graying and looking older, etc. So if you want to know who you have to thank, the Midrash says you have to thank Abraham. Abraham complained to God or made a suggestion. He said, you know, we got a problem that when a father and a son come into a room and there's no aging process, people don't know who's the father and who's the son. They don't know who to honor. So Hashem says, Amar li HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chayecha davar tov tabata. You know what? You've asked for a very good thing. Umimcha hu matchil. Mitchilat hasefer va'ad kan ein ktiv Until Abraham, the word zikna is never mentioned. It never mentions that a person became old. V'kevan she'amad Abraham natan lo zikna. But once Abraham came along, we have a pasuk, Abraham zakein ba b'yamin. In other words, the Midrash notices that the first time the word zakein appears is by Abraham, and so it weaves this narrative that Abraham requested zikna, that there is a value in graying and starting to look older because people can recognize your status. Okay. Yitzchak tava yisurim. Yitzchak is the one who asked for suffering. How? Amar lefanav, ribon kol ha'olamim, adam meit lo yisurim midat hadin metucha kenegdo. Mitoch she'ata mevi alav yisurim ein midat hadin metucha kenegdo. So Yitzchak says, when a person dies and they didn't suffer on their way to dying, then midat hadin, the judgment awaits. But when a person experiences suffering, then midat hadin doesn't have much to say. Amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and God says to him, Chayecha davar tov tabata. He says, you've asked for a good thing. Umincha ani matchil, and from you it begins. Mitchilat hasefer v'ad kan ein tiv yisurim. So again, the Midrash bases it on the fact that from beginning of Sefer Breshit until Yitzchak, you don't hear about anyone who, when they got older, they suffered. V'kevan she'amad Yitzchak natan lo yisurim. But once Yitzchak came along, what do we hear? Vayehi ki zakein Yitzchak. So not only that Yitzchak was zakein, vatichena einav mer'ot. He was blind. He could no longer see. So it's not just that he starts looking old, but that he actually suffers. Here, the suffering is the dimming of his eyes. That's what's called suffering here. So I just want to read through it because it's a fascinating midrash. Yaakov tabat hacholi. And if you want to know who to blame for the fact that we often get sick, especially as we get older, Amar lefanav, ribon olamim, adam meit lo choli, beino miyashev bein banav. So Yaakov says a person dies, but he didn't get sick before, and he just drops dead. He doesn't have time to kind of settle things with his family, with his children, etc. But if he gets sick for a few days before he dies, he has time to settle his affairs, to put things in order, to settle things in his family. So again, God says, excellent idea, and it will start from you. And again, this idea being that nobody in Sefer Breshit became sick until Yaakov. Vayomer liYosef hinei avicha choleh. So, and then it goes on to talk about Hiskiyahu. I will add my own. I don't know who, but a parent said to God, you know, we have this terrible situation. We got these cute little kids at home, and we're going to have to send them out to the world. We can't do that. He says, oh, excellent. You asked for something? Welcome to adolescence. Then you'll see you'll have no trouble sending them out of the house. That would be my addition to this midrash along the same kind of lines. But the reason I brought the midrash is really for that middle part, since our topic is suffering, is yisurim, that here, again, it's suggesting yisurim, suffering, as having a positive purpose. That in this case, again, it's not about punishment, but it is about atonement, which is not the same. So here it's meant to affect some kind of atonement in a person, which then prepares them, so to speak, for Olam Haba. Okay. So again, that's, I would say, in keeping with the previous sources, and here putting a positive spin on the notion of Yisurim, just as it puts a positive spin on old age and getting sick in old age before you die. Okay, moving along to source number 4. Amar le Rabbi Alexandri, Ein lecha adam v'lo Yisurim. Okay, this I find first and foremost, just right there, Rabbi Alexandri says there is no person who does not suffer. Okay, so already with that statement, we cannot have one reason for suffering. There cannot be one reason for it, because it is part and parcel of the human experience. Shene'emar u'mitoratcha tilamdenu. Happy is the person, or lucky is the person, for whom suffering comes to him min ha-Torah. So that's open to interpretation, what it means from the Torah. As it says, u'mitoratcha tilamdenu. Amar Rav Yoshua ben Levi, Kol yisurin she'en ba'in al ha'adam u'mevatlim oto midivrei Torah, yisurin shel tochacha הם. אבל ייסורים שהם באים על האדם ואין מבטלים אותו מדברי תורה, ייסורים של אהבה הם. כדכתיב, כי את אשר יאהב השם יוכיח. Okay, so now a new concept is introduced. We now have two kinds of suffering. We have suffering known as ייסורים של תוכחה, a suffering that is meant to rebuke, to chastise, to tell a person you need to improve your ways. And we have something known as Yisurim Shel Ahava. What we talked about earlier is that suffering of love, that somehow it's an expression of divine love. And how do we distinguish between the two? How do we know if we're in the divine love category or we're in the rebuke category? It's a question of whether it causes bitul Torah. Now, if it causes bitul Torah, if it causes you not to be able to study Torah, it's tochacha. But if you can continue to study Torah, it's Yisurim Shel Ahava. Why that distinction? Why does it depend on the study of Torah? If you can continue to study Torah or not, why is that the distinction for knowing whether it's rebuke or love?
So perhaps the idea of finding meaning and being able to improve yourself through the study of Torah. So you're still able to do something with the suffering.
Oh, okay. So you're saying that while you're still studying Torah, it means that then you're doing something with it. So that would be Yisurin Shel Ahava. And if you're not able to study Torah, then it's rebuke. Perhaps suggesting that if you're not able to study Torah, it's such a severe kind of suffering that maybe that it's more severe.
You can't go forward with it.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe that you decide whether it's Ahava or not. Whether if you continue to learn Torah, it's Ahava.
Aha, that's interesting. Okay, very interesting perspective. Okay, so in other words, that's interesting. That it has to do with what the person understands or does with it. If it's something that turns a person away, then built in is that it's some kind of rebuke. That you need to change something. And if it's something that leads a person to continue to be able to study Torah, then it's a sign of his relationship, the nature of his relationship to God. That's very interesting. Other? Yeah.
Well, if you can continue to study Torah, you would come up with the idea that you are completely correct and there is nothing that you are blamed for.
Okay.
So if you have, otherwise, if you cannot study Torah, at least you have time to correct your mistakes.
Okay. Yeah.
I would say if you can't study Torah, probably because you're angry or frustrated or just don't want this connection anymore at that time because you can't deal with it. And if you can continue, it means you probably, enough that you can go on because you don't feel that anything's stopping you. You don't feel that you did anything wrong. If I look, for example, with my kids, if I rebuke them or if I catch them doing something when they know they're wrong, that's usually when they get the most angry and start screaming and slamming doors and hysterical. And when they know that they weren't really wrong, then it's usually not that reaction.
Okay. So somewhat related. That in other words, it has to do with the person's reaction about whether they want to continue to study Torah, and that says something about their relationship to God or whether they think they've done something wrong. I would also suggest that, sure, go ahead.
A question where maybe two people, what about those that don't study Torah in the first place?
Okay, so that's true. In the eyes right now in the world of Chazal, while they recognize it, you have sources like that, but right now a lot of these sources are concerned with one who is, right, one who is involved in the world of Torah. In other words, a lot of these sources are for Talmidei Chachamim. A lot of the dialogue, a lot of the discussion, a lot of the thinking is for that. In other words, their discussions are within themselves for Talmidei Chachamim. So they are in a world where But that's true, you're right. I would add that I think that in the world of Chazal, studying Torah replaced Nivu'ah, right? Once Nivu'ah stopped, what do we have left? We have the study of Torah, and that one's relationship to God is channeled through the study of Torah. That's the form of communication with God, this studying of Torah. So, along the lines of what people said, where one can continue this relationship, so it's a sign that God is not pushing them away by this suffering. So that's why it's a sign of Yisurin Shel Ahava, reflects a loving relationship. Where the person is no longer able to communicate with God, so to speak, through the study of Torah, because of their suffering, this source is suggesting that that would be a sign that God has pushed them away in the form of rebuking them. Yeah?
Do you imply that the rabbis here express some kind of surprise of the fact that they are Yisurim, but for the general population who are not studying Torah, it would be normal?
No. I think that this source opens with Amar le Rav Alexandri, Ein lecha adam v'lo yisurim. There's no person who doesn't suffer. But I think that the answers that they give about the meaning is not for someone who doesn't believe, right? They're trying to struggle with these questions about suffering within a community of those who share their belief system. So they're suggesting answers within the belief system. If you're not within the belief system, they're not addressing you. They are trying to address it within their community who are struggling with this question. Yeah, oh, you wanted to ask something.
Yes, what would you say about Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who was so much suffering that I think the rabbi prayed that he should die? Would you say that it was Yisurin Shel Torah?
So, hold off on that question, because we are going to see a full range of opinions. I've only gotten to meaning not everything has to fit in, even within this source. We don't have to accept that it is either Yisurin Shel Ahava or Yisurin Shel Tochacha. That is one approach. But the sources that we're looking at span hundreds of years and different rabbis, so we have a multiplicity of opinions. So I don't have to answer that about what it was for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, because we've already seen a number that I could say that it's Yisurin Shel Ahava or Yisurin Shel Tochacha. I could talk about it as something that is purifying, like Yitzhak, who kavah Yisurin, so that it purifies the person. And we will see more and more sources that even suggest completely other approaches.
And furthermore, we have a few rabbis who were suspected to suffer from Yisurin Shel Ahava and didn't want it.
Yeah, we're going to get to a story like that, yes.
Give me the hand and I will take you off.
Right, that's right. Not everybody wants, right? So until now, we didn't just start looking at the time, but we've only gotten through a few of the approaches. We didn't even get to the most radical yet, so hang on and stay awake, and here we go. Okay, so now we come to some different approaches. Reshit Rabbah, some of you may be familiar with this. Reshit Rabbah, course number 5. Hashem Tzadik Yivchan, V'Rasha Bohev Chamas Snei'a Nafsho. Now we introduce the idea of Yivchan, a test. That Hashem Tzadik Yivchan. God specifically tries a righteous person, and a Rasha, he is not interested in. He hates. Amar Rabbi Yonatan, Hayotzer hazeh ino bodek kankanim meruahim sheino mekish alein achat ad shehi pokad. Uma bodek kankanim yafim sheafilu hu mekish alav kama paimim eino nishbar. Kach ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu menaseh ela et hatzadikim. So this is on Breshit Rabbah. In Breshit we have numerous examples of tzaddikim being tested. First and foremost, Abraham, right? Va'alokim nisa et Abraham. It's not subtle. It's not something we have to read into it. The text states God tested Abraham. God tried Abraham. So the Midrash is referring to those tests of the Avot. How do we understand this idea of a righteous person being challenged and tried? So we have 3 answers, and the Chamalelu is on the, I think it's with Avraham quotes this midrash and explains the differences between the three different rabbis. They seem similar, but they're not the same. First, Rabbi Yonatan says, what is it like? It's like a potter, somebody who makes pottery. When he wants to, which pottery does he bang on to show that it's sturdy, that it's a good quality product? He doesn't take one that he knows is weak, because he bangs on it and it's going to fall apart. Instead, he takes one that is not going to break, that you can bang on a few times and it still holds itself. So too, Hashem only tests the righteous. The idea being that only the righteous are going to withstand the test, are going to come out from the test successfully. We have another opinion. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Haphishtani azeh b'sha'ah shu yodea she'hapishtan shelo yafeh, kol shehu kodsha hi mishtabachat, v'kol shehu mekish alea hi mishtamenet. ובשעה שהוא יודע שפשתנו רעה, אינו מספיק להקיש עליה עד שהיא פוקעת. כך אין הקדוש ברוך הוא מנסה אליה את הצדיקים, שנאמר עצם צדיק יבחן. We have Rabbi Yossi who says that a person who has flax, when he knows that this flax is good, he can bang on it, and the more he bangs, the better it becomes, the stronger it becomes. But when he has flax that's not a good quality, if you bang on it, it falls apart. And so too, God tries the tzaddikim. And the third opinion, Rabbi Eliezer Amar, Abal Habayit Shayu Lo Bet Parot. Rabbi Eliezer said, you know what it's like? It's like an owner who has two cows. Achat kocha yafa, achat kocha ra. One cow is strong and the other one's weak. Al mihu noten ha'ol, lo al tashe kocha yafa. Who does he put a burden on? If he has two animals, one's weak and one's strong, of course he puts the burden on the one that's strong. So too, Hashem tests the tzaddik. Now, at first glance, these three look very similar, but they're actually not. Can you notice what's the difference between, it looks like they're each using their own allegory, but saying the same thing, but they're actually not saying the same thing. They're saying three different ideas about why God tests the righteous.
Rabbi Eliezer uses useful test, but the other that go to the first Rabbi Yonatan, it seems that it's a test without purpose. It's הוא נותן עול על האורכה שככה יפה, מפני שהוא צריך לעול, אבל במקרה של רבי יונתן לא רואים את המטרה.
Okay, why do you not see the purpose of why does a potter bang on his pottery? Why would a potter bang on his pottery?
Yes, to be able to sell it.
Right. The idea probably there is that you're doing it usually to show a customer. So the idea there is, who might the test be for?
To give an example.
To give an example. Okay, so you can understand that what Rabbi Yonatan is saying is that the potter who bangs on the pottery, it's not for the pottery itself. It doesn't make the pottery stronger when you bang on it. But rather it shows to others that this is good pottery. That suggests that the challenge of the tzaddik, or the suffering, is not necessarily for the tzaddik himself, but rather for those around who witness this tzaddik withstanding the test, and that has an impact on them. The second one, who says about the flax, you beat the flax, what's the idea there of the test of a tzaddik? Who's it for, and what does it accomplish?
It's for the tzaddik
It's for the tzaddik himself in that, what? It strengthens the tzaddik. Okay, the first one you could also say that you could see it as just for others, or the fact that the pottery itself, so to speak, knows that it was tested and it withstood it. In other words, there is some effect it has on the person who was tested to know they've come through it. That has an effect on the person. But look at the third one, Rabbi Eliezer. What is he saying? What is the purpose of a test? Of a tzaddik? Well, that's interesting. Where do you see that it's the suffering of others?
Well, if you would have put it on the weaker cow, then he would have suffered much more than the stronger one.
Okay, I didn't think of it that way. So you're saying that you read this as him saying that basically the stronger one is carrying it for both, so to speak. Okay, that would be a
uses the cow, so he might as well just use a stronger cow for his purpose.
What purpose is that?
Well, who knows?
Okay, the truth is that's true. I would say the third source really begs the question. It says basically when you have a stronger cow, that cow's going to carry more. It doesn't really say why. It doesn't strengthen a cow. I mean, it does, muscle-wise, but the point doesn't seem to be here to strengthen the cow. It doesn't seem to be to show to others, but rather some idea that the more you can bear, the more you will get to bear. That somehow you can, also this notion that you can withstand it. There is within that built in that you're only getting something that you are strong enough to withstand. Yeah, different reaction.
Is there meaning to it that one uses a domain, the other a zomer, the third one high?
That's interesting. I never noticed that. What meaning would you, that's an interesting observation. What meaning would you give? Because I didn't notice it, so I didn't think about a meaning. Okay, interesting. I don't know. Yeah, others?
That means we have a choice to be the strong one or the weak one.
That's it.
Oh, well, I don't know. That's interesting. Meaning, I don't know if they're necessarily cows, which are the image being used, choose whether you can. It's true, you can go to a kind of kosher, etc. But I think that the notion here is not that the cow is choosing, but rather within the nature. Some are stronger, some are less strong, and the burden is given according to your strength. I think that's what it's saying. It's not really answering the question why, but it is suggesting that there is a relationship between your strength and what you have to bear. Yeah.
I was thinking in tying it in with Yisurim Shel Ahava, that Dafka, those are the ones, those who could withstand the Yisurim, who are going to find meaning and who are going to be able to continue to study Torah and make something out of it.
Okay. And that's possible. You could put these sources together, but you can also see them as separate, since they're said by different rabbis at different points to address different questions also. For example, here it's really looking at the tzaddik who is being tested. Okay, so here we've seen a lot of positive ideas about Yisurim. One almost gets the feeling like, shouldn't we be wanting some suffering? I mean, look, it refines and whatever. So, relax. We can rely on Rabbah in the next source, number 6. Rabbah, on concluding his prayer, added the following. Okay, this is something that people say before going to sleep. Elokai. Just forgot the Hebrew. Before I was formed, I was not worthy. Okay, so until I was formed, I was not worthy, and now that I've been formed, it's as if I have not been formed. In other words, I'm not worthy. I am dust in my lifetime, all the more in my death. Behold, I am before you like a vessel full of shame and confusion. May it be your will that I sin no more, and the sins I have committed before you wipe out through great mercies, but not through Yisurim. Okay? Here, Rabbah explicitly states, I do not want Yisurim. So, despite the fact that until now we have been finding reasons or meaning within Yisurim, nevertheless, as we see from Rabbah, a person does not need to invite upon themselves or wish for Yisurim. No, it certainly isn't a notion that one has to look to find suffering. Now we have another source, number 7, I think that also is along the lines that after we hear different phrases for suffering, and we hear the notion that if you suffer, it can be Yisurim Shel Ahava, an expression of God's close relationship, the feeling you can have is, so I want to suffer too, or, why am I being left out? Look at the source in Arachim. This is very interesting. At what stage is it considered suffering? Okay, so what constitutes Yisurim? How do you know if you've experienced Yisurim? Rabbi Lazar said, if a man had, for example, a garment made for him to wear, and it doesn't fit him, okay, you want to know what Yisurim are? You go to the tailor, you order something, you get there, it doesn't fit. Rabbah, the younger, or some say Rav Zera, etc., demurred to this. But more that was said, even if he had been intended to serve him the wine hot, and it was served cold to him, or if it was intended to be served cold and it was served hot, this is an example of Yisurin. This is an example of divine visitation. Yisurin, this is your Yisurin. Okay, so the soup comes, you're ready for that hot soup, it's cold. Can you heat it up, please? That's your Yisurin for the day. Okay, and you say only at that stage does it have to go so far that I have to have cold soup to suffer? No. Mar, the son of Rabina, said, even if his shirt gets turned inside out. Okay, you're getting up one day, you put on your shirt, you put it on inside out, you walk outside, someone says, you know, your shirt's inside, oh God, well, go back inside, that's your Yisurin. You got your Yisurin for the day. Rabbah, or as others say, Rav Chisda, even if he puts the hand into his pocket to take out 3 coins and he takes out 2. Now this is only a case where he intended to take out 3 and took out 2, but not if he meant to take out 2 and 3 came into his hand. Because it's no trouble to throw it back. But, okay, so this almost sounds comical, right? This is, each one's going to a lower level, right? You started with that, you know, if your dress doesn't come out well. Now, I experienced that, right? 2 days before the wedding, had a wedding dress made, got there, it does not fit. Let me tell you, that was not a picnic, okay? So I understand that. But I just pulled in, when it reached in my pocket, I pulled out 2 coins, and oh, darn, gotta get that 3rd coin. Right? You see how it's going down and down. That's also Yisurin. What's this source doing? We didn't get to the last line, but what do you think this is about? Why are they going down and down and down?
It's ironic.
It is ironic. What do you think the idea here is? What's it trying to express? You could see it as ironic, you could take it seriously. Let's look at it both ways. So when you see it as ironic, why are the rabbis coming up with these different things that are Yisurin?
All depends what you made out of it. Because sometimes you can be extremely upset to just have 2 coins because you need 3. And, you know, I think it's the reaction to small things in life.
Okay, so if we take this seriously, we can say that the truth is that there are all these little, in daily life, all these little small aggravations and difficulties that are built into life. And those too are a form of Yisurin. And certainly for the person who's sensitive to it, there are all different levels of suffering. And this often, you know, if I think about it in this way, you know, a lot of times as a therapist, people will come in and feel guilty for complaining. They'll say, well, I don't really suffer. It's not like, you know, it's not like we're starving, we're living in Africa starving, or it's not like we're living in Syria. I wasn't sexually abused. They'll come up with all sorts of explanations about why they don't really suffer. And one of the things that I think a person learns, hopefully, in life and in therapy is we don't compare suffering. That doesn't work psychologically, because when we suffer, we experience our suffering. And we don't say, yeah, but this is not as bad as someone else's suffering. Perhaps on a cognitive level, we sometimes do that. But when we suffer, with whatever it is we suffer, we don't think, but how many people suffer worse. That doesn't in any way decrease our suffering or help us with it. So you could see it in that light. Look at the last line, though, if we want to read it in a more ironic way. But why all this information? Why are the rabbis going through these specifications? Because the school of Rabbi Shmuel taught anyone upon whom 40 days have passed without suffering had received his reward in this world. In other words, if you didn't experience suffering for 40 days, so you don't have much reward in the world to come. You got it all now. You're on easy street. Now, on one level, you can see that saying that, like we said before, essentially it's saying everyone suffers. If you haven't even experienced these minor sufferings, then you really have gotten your reward in this world, because nobody has it that good. But on another level, you could see this really as a challenge to the other opinions that we have seen. The other opinions are suggesting that there is meaning, first of all, not only is there meaning in suffering, but that it's an expression of a divine connection, and that this is something that one might look for or want or have to have. And by making the suffering trivial, it's in a sense neutralizing these other sources. In a sense, it's saying, oh, okay, so you want to talk about how you a sign of God's love, etc., and it's necessary, okay, well you can beyotze your Yisurin even with these light kinds of Yisurin. Essentially, it's sidestepping the idea of Yisurin. Do you understand what I mean? So, in a sense, it's paying lip service to this notion that we all suffer and that this is part of a process of atonement or purification or refinement, but it really is saying, no, we don't have to have that. By saying that you get off if you've had any of these minor kinds of suffering. So there are different ways to read the story. Yeah?
Even this English wants to tell something much more profound. One of the explanations of suffering is that there is not God is behind it, but it's Olam Keminagona Rek. The world is working as it is working. Sometimes you get caught in suffering, sometimes the others are caught in suffering. But God is not behind it. And your work in this world is to live in a world which Olam Keminagona Rek. And you would think this is a modern philosophical idea. It's not. The Ramban says it in Iyov.
Okay, we're going to see that more explicitly, but where do you see it in the story? I hear what you're saying, but where do you see that in the story? In other words, it ends, not story, the source, it ends by saying, why all this information? Because Rabbi Shmuel taught anyone upon whom 40 days has passed without suffering has received his reward. That is suggesting divine intervention.
But the reward means that you will live in this strange world, which sometimes you suffer, sometimes you don't, and you make your best out of it. That's your purpose in this world.
Okay. I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure if I would say this is the strongest source suggesting Olam Kamin Hago No Hey. But I see, meaning it certainly is, it is taking a challenging position towards the other ones of the meaning of Yisurim. Yes, definitely. I would agree with that. What?
It doesn't happen. There's no such thing as 40 days going by
That's
and
right.
nobody suffers. So
Right.
it's like, it's an impossibility, and so that's not how the world is meant to be. So it fits in with what...
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's continue on just so we get through all the sources. Midrash Rabbah. Now we're taking a whole different spin on it. Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, source 8, where Rabbi Yonatan, Rabbi Chama bar Chanina Amar, Ra'ui haya adam harishon shelo lit'om tam mita. ולמה נכנסה בו מיתה? אלא צפה הקדוש ברוך הוא שנבוכדנצר וחיל המלך צור עתידים לעשות עצמן אלוהות, ולפיכך נכנסה בו מיתה. עד דכתיב, בעדן גן אלוהים היית, וכי בגן עדן היה חירם? איתמה, אלא אמר לו, אתה הוא שגרמת לאותו שבעדן שימות. Reb Chia bar, I'm going to just summarize it in short after I finish reading it. Reb Chia bar Barke, the Rab Barke, Mishum Rab Bracha, Rachei, Sham. Let me just say that proof. It's proof ממשיך, I'm not sure where that's from. אתה הוא שגרמת לו תוך שימות. אמר לי רב יונתן, אם כן יגזור מיתה על הרשעים ואל יגזור מיתה על הצדיקים, אלא שלא יהיו רשעים, הרשעים עושים תשובה של רמאיות, ושלא יהיו הרשעים אומרים כלום הצדיקים חיים, אלא שהם מסגלים מצוות ומעשים טובים, אף אנו מסגל מצוות ומעשים טובים, נמצאת עשייה שלא נשמע. Okay, I want to paraphrase the last part of it. First part is also related. That why did it starts with why did Adam Harishon die, but later it talks about why do tzaddikim die, and it explains that the righteous die because of the wicked. Why? Because if the righteous had it good, and the wicked saw this, they would also be invested in doing good, so that they would come out with the same reward. And it would turn out that they would be doing tshuva, basically of deceit. They don't really want to do tshuva, they want the positive life, the good life that the tzaddikim have. Basically, this source is presenting a completely different idea that we haven't yet seen. In other words, this is talking on a more global, universal universal level, not about why the individual suffers and how it relates to their personal relationship to God or what meaning they find in it, but rather a more global reasoning as to why there's a system of justice that is not clear in this world, where when you do good, you have the good life, and when you don't do good, you suffer. Because if that was the case, everybody would be doing the good life. So basically, this is a free will argument, which you often hear when you study the ideas about theodicy, about why there is suffering in the world, why do the righteous suffer, the notion of there needing to be free will in this world, the importance of free will, and if every time you do good, the result is a good life, and when you do bad, the result is suffering, then nobody would be choosing to do bad. Everybody would be choosing to do good. And this source is really talking about the importance of, or the reason for suffering among the righteous, or among people who are good and don't seem to deserve it, as serving the purpose of free will, a much broader idea. Okay, along those lines of not giving it personal meaning, but talking rather about the way in which the world works, we come to Bava Kama. Rabbi Yosef learned, what is the meaning of the verse? And none of you shall go out at the door of this house until morning. This is talking about Yetziat Mitzrayim, that nobody was allowed, none of the Jews were allowed to leave the house. Why did they have to stay in the house while Malach HaMavet was going out in Egypt? Once permission has been granted to the destroyer, he does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. Moreover, he even begins with the righteous at the very outset, as it says, and I will cut off from the So, Rabbi Yosef wept at this, saying, so much that they compared to nothing, but Abaye consoled him, saying, this is for their advantage, as it is written, that the righteous is taken away from the evil to come. So here too we have an idea that talks more about the way in which God runs the world, or the way in which the world runs, and not as much in terms of the personal meaning for the individual. And if source number 8 was talking about the reason why justice is not clear in this world and righteous suffer is for free will, in Bava Kama it's saying that once there is permission given for destruction, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. It doesn't really explain why that is, but it's descriptive in saying this. And you find this actually quoted by Rashi a number of times in Chumash, that there is no distinction made, and therefore the righteous will also suffer in a situation where God is punishing the wicked. Not only that, but they will often be the ones to die first. And here we see contradictory responses of Rabbi Yosef and Abaye. Rabbi Yosef crying and saying, this makes no sense. Then they are compared to nothing. If the righteous have the same fate as the wicked, so what's the point? And Abaye consoles him, saying the fact that the righteous are killed first is actually protects them from the evil to come. In other words, they die first, and then they don't have to experience the evil that is to come. Okay, so very different than what we've seen. Now, echoing what you mentioned in the back, Moed Katan. Here we take everything we've said until now and present a completely different approach that says it really is somewhat arbitrary. Rabbah said, length of life, children, and sustenance depend not on merit, but rather on mazal. Okay, that is quite a dramatic statement. How long we live, what happens to our children, and whether they live and die, and our economic situation is dependent on mazal. Well, if those are dependent on mazal, what's really left? I mean, these are the major areas of our lives. Earning a living, our families, and how long we live. For take Rabbah and Rav Chisda. Both were saintly rabbis. Okay, yeah, Rabbah and Rav Chisda, who both were equally saintly, says this source. One master prayed for rain and it came. The other master prayed for rain and it came. So you see that they were both righteous. They could both bring down rain. Rav Chisda lived to the age of 92. Rabba only lived to the age of 40. In Rav Chisda's house, there were held 60 marriages feasts. At Rabba's house, there were 60 bereavements. At Rav Chisda's house, there were the purest wheaten bread for dogs, and it went to waste. At Rabba's house, there was barley bread for human beings, and that not to be had. Okay, so we have Rav Chisda and Rabba. They're both saying they can both bring down rain at their request. And yet, their lot in life was so dramatically different, with one being healthy, living till 92, having many marriages in the family, and living a wealthy life, and the other one who suffered greatly, died early, lost many family members, didn't have enough to eat. This too, Rabba said, these three requests I made of heaven, two were granted to me and one was not. I prayed for the scholarship of Rav Huna and the wealth of Rav Chisda, which was granted to me, but the modest disposition of Rabba, son of Rav Huna, was not granted to me. Okay, we're going to leave that extra for the side. But here we have a statement that says what you said. We don't know. We don't know, and sometimes it seems to be arbitrary. That you can have people who are equally righteous, and one suffers and one doesn't. And it doesn't seem to necessarily reflect neither God's love for them, not their righteousness, not even to say that God is challenging them to grow. But Rav Chisda doesn't need to be challenged, and Rabba does. This source is saying, ultimately, we don't know. And there are times or situations, or those of us who, what comforts us perhaps the most is to say, there isn't a reason that we can understand. That some of it is a question of mazel. For some that will be a comfort, and for others that will not be a comfort at all. Like going back to the very first one.
I say more than that. You say there isn't a reason we can understand. I say there is no reason.
Okay.
We can understand, we cannot understand, there is no reason. It's Bollag minagono he.
Okay.
We live in this world, and in this
That's
world,
true.
that's what is happening.
That's true, and I think that this source could be saying exactly that. The minute it's saying it's mazel, it's saying Bollag minagono he. Yep. Yes, I would say that this source is supporting exactly what you said. Okay, so now we turn to the issue of, we have an example in our next source of rabbis who actually did suffer. Rabbi Yochanan, this is again in Brachot, with the earlier sources that we quoted. Rabbi Yochanan was afflicted, becoming ill with chills and fever for 3.5 years. So until now we talked in theory, other than the first source that we saw. Now we're going to talk in practice. What happens when these rabbis suffered? So Rabbi Yochanan suffered for 3.5 years with a serious illness. Rabbi Hanina went up to visit him. He said, "What is with you?" He said to him, "It is more than I can bear." Basically, he asked, "How are you doing?" And Rabbi Yochanan said, "I can't take this." He said to him, "Don't say that. Rather say the faithful God." Okay? So Rabbi Hanina chastises Rabbi Yochanan for saying, "I can't take it," and says instead, you should accept it with love. Okay? There is a source that we skipped that talks about part of Yisurin Shel Avad, you have to accept it with love. When his pain became greater, he would say the faithful God. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan accepted this, and when he could, he would declare his belief in God. But when his pain became too great for him, Rabbi Hanina went up to him, recited an incantation over him, and he was healed. So at a certain point, when Rabbi Yochanan was at his breaking point, then Rabbi Hanina prayed for him, and Rabbi Yochanan was healed. When it went beyond the point that Rabbi Yochanan could learn anything from it, then Rabbi Hanina prayed for him and healed him. After some days, Rabbi Hanina became ill. Okay, now we have the reverse. Now Rabbi Hanina became ill. Rabbi Yochanan went up to visit him. He said to him, "How are you doing?" He said to him, "How difficult are sufferings?" Okay, so here now, when Rav Huna is in Rabbi Yochanan's position, his response is very different. How difficult are sufferings? He who just told Rabbi Yochanan, you have to accept them lovingly. He said to him, "But how great is their reward?" Rabbi Yochanan says, "Yes, but the reward is great, Yisurin." He said to him, "I want neither them nor their reward." He said to him, "Then why do you not recite that incantation that you recited over me and thus heal yourself?" So Rabbi Yochanan said, "Okay, you healed me, so now heal yourself." He said to him, "When I was outside, I could act as a guarantor for others, but while I'm inside, do I not require others to act as guarantors for me?" He's basically saying, I can't pray for myself. Someone else has to pray on my behalf. And Rabbi Yochanan's response is, he said to him, who feeds among the lilies, he quotes a pasuk, the rod of the Holy One, blessed be He, only comes to a person who is pliant like a lily. In other words, when you suffer, you have to accept it. You have to be pliant like a lily. So we have a reverse of situation. When Rabbi Yochanan was suffering, then Rav Hanina says to him, you have to accept it lovingly. And Rabbi Yochanan says, this is very difficult, but he does. And when it's reversed, Rav Hanina, now that he's in the position, says, I want to have nothing to do with this suffering. I don't want it, and I don't want its reward. One of the things that I think is strongest about this source is that until now we were talking about all these different ideas about what suffering might mean. But there's a big difference between theorizing about what suffering might mean when you're on the outside and when you're experiencing it. Both in terms of ourselves, even as we think about these ideas, while these ideas might be interesting for us on the cognitive level, on the intellectual level, when we actually have to struggle, we have to make meaning anew. It's not enough to kind of have learned something cognitively, but when we experience it, it's a whole different challenge for finding the meaning. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have to be very wary when we look to comfort somebody else. It's very easy to stand outside and to try to explain to someone else what the meaning of their suffering is. And you see that Rabbi Hanina understands it very differently a few days later when he is experiencing it himself. And I think that's also very true with the first source that we saw. I pointed that out, that before Rabbi Shmuel tries to comfort Rabbi Shimon, he says, do you want me to say something? Before he tries this route of trying to give meaning, he first asks Rabbi Shimon, do you want me to suggest a meaning? Because sometimes a person does not want someone on the outside to suggest a meaning. They don't want to hear it, or they need to find it for themselves. So the first thing he does is to find out, do you want to hear it? Okay, and in closing, after we've talked about all these different possible ways of thinking about it, understanding it, and explaining it, the bottom line is that oftentimes we don't have an explanation, and when we experience the suffering, sometimes we do not want to accept it, and in fact, our response is to challenge or to question it. And this too is reflected in Chazal, and with that I want to end with a very powerful story in Gemara Yoma. Damar Rav Yoshua ben Levi, Lama nikra shman Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. Why were the men of the great assembly, known as Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the precursors to the Sanhedrin, why were they called Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the great assembly? The reason is, Shehachziru atara liyoshna. They returned the glory to its previous level. What does that mean? Ata Moshe amar ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanora. Moshe comes and calls God Hakel hagadol hagibor v'hanora. He praises God with these 4 terms. Ata Yirmiyah, comes Yirmiyahu. Now, if you look in Sefer Yirmiyahu, you find similar words, except it doesn't say Hakel hagadol hagibor v'hanora, it just says Hakel hagadol hagibor. It leaves out the word Norah. Based on the fact that Yirmiyahu doesn't say the word Norah, the Gemara, the Agadah, weaves this idea into why Yirmiyahu left it out. Atai Yirmiyah, comes Yirmiyahu, V'amar nachrim mekarkarim be'eichalo ayei norotav. Yirmiyahu lived in a different time than Moshe. He lived in a time when the temple was destroyed. So he says, non-Jews are reigning free in the Beit HaMikdash. Where is the Nora'ut, the awesomeness of God? There's no awesomeness if they could come in and desecrate the temple. Lo amar Norah. So he said, I'm not saying the word Norah. I don't see it, I'm not saying it. Atad Daniel, comes Daniel, amar Nachrim ishtabdim bebanav ayei gvuratav. Daniel lived in another period where the Jews were subservient to the non-Jews. So he says, ayei gvurotav, where are the gvurot of God? Lo amar gibor, meaning in Sefer Daniel you find Hakel hagadol without the word hagibor. Atu inhu, came Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, v'amru adarabah, zohi gvurat gvurato. So come Anshe Knesset Hagdolah and say, No, actually the Gvura of God is Shekoveshet Yisro Shenoten Erech Hapayim L'Rishayim. One of the Gvurot of God is that He tolerates the existence of these Rishayim. Ve'elohei Norotav, and also we see the Noraut of God. She'il Malei Nora'o Sha'akadosh Baruch Hu, if not for God's awesomeness, Hei Chuma Achat Yichula L'Yitkayim Bein Ha'omo. The Jewish people wouldn't exist. It wouldn't just be the temple that was destroyed, but they wouldn't exist anymore. So this is why they're called Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, because they return the description of God to its original. Where did they return it? Where did they go back to Hakel HaGedolah Gibor HaMorah? What's it referring to? It's referring to in Tefillah. Anshe Knesset HaGedolah established the Shmona Esrei, and in the Shmona Esrei we start off with Hakel HaGadol HaGibor HaMorah, Tel Elyon. Right? They chose the language of Moshe. So to speak, they returned the glory to the past. Now here's the interesting part. V'Rabbanan hechi avdi hachi, v'akrei takanta d'takim Moshe. And how is it that the rabbis, in this case what they mean is Yirmiyahu and Daniel, how did they uproot a takana, a language that Moshe established? Moshe established this terminology. How did they dare change it? Amar Reb Elazar, mitoch sheyodin b'kadosh baruch hu she'amiti hu lefichach lo kizbu bo. Says Rabbi Elazar, because they know that God is truthful, they were not willing to lie. And therefore they would not say that which they did not believe or they did not think. Very dramatic. These figures who are called Rabbanan, Daniel, and Yirmiyahu would not lie. They would not, so to speak, praise God when they don't see it in front of them. It is a form of protest. Right? They're not. Yirmiyahu does actually question God's justice in the world, not right here in this pasuk of Hakel HaGadol HaGibor, but in other places. And here we see within this source that also challenging or complaining or questioning why there is suffering, although that's not, I mean, this is along the lines, is also a response to suffering. It is also a form of communicating with God and challenging, why is it that I'm suffering? So we see that not only are there attempts to give meaning to suffering and to explain it in religious ways, we also see the approach that says it could be mazel, a lot of this. But we also see the idea of not only accepting it, but that there is also a notion of challenging it. And with that, I'll end. If you want to raise any questions or share some thoughts.
And why did the Knesset HaGedolah change it? Because there were no reason. Situation was worsening.
So here you see that it's also dependent on your perspective. In other words, Anshe Knesset HaGedolah found a way to understand where they saw the Gvura and the Noraut reflected in a way different from how Yirmiyahu and Daniel interpreted Noraut. But Yirmiyahu and Daniel did not accept such a frum explanation. Anshe Knesset HaGedolah did interpret it in that way. They did see it that way, but Yirmiyahu didn't and Daniel didn't